In Scottish law, there exists a verdict available in no other legal system in the world. Not proven. It does not mean innocent. It does not mean the jury disbelieved the evidence. What it means, what it has always meant, in practice, if not in statute, is this: we think you probably did it. We cannot prove it to the standard the law requires. Go. The door is there. Use it. In June of 1857, a 21-year-old woman in Glasgow received that verdict for murder. She walked out of the Edinburgh courtroom into morning light, and she lived for another 71 years. She outlasted her lawyers. She outlasted her judges. She outlasted everyone who had read her letters aloud in open court, the letters she had written to a man she had loved, then feared, then, in the account of the Crown, killed. She never spoke of the trial, not once, in 7 decades, to anyone who left a record of it. What is recorded is that the letters still exist. They are held in an archive. Her handwriting, girlish in its loops, adult in its hunger, is preserved on paper that has not rotted in 160 years. She was 21 when she wrote them. She was 21 when they were read aloud to a packed courtroom while she sat and listened. Whatever she felt in that room, she did not let it reach her face. That is where this story begins. Not with her birth, not with his, with the letters, and with the question the jury refused to answer. Glasgow in 1855 had a smell to it that visitors noted and residents stopped noticing. Coal smoke and river damp and the particular sourness of a city building itself too fast, laying down stone faster than it could lay down drainage. The tenements rose, the merchant class rose with them, and in the terraced houses of Blitheswood Hill, the families who had made money from cotton and tobacco and the long Atlantic trade installed themselves behind curtained windows and maintained with extraordinary effort the fiction that they were something other than newly arrived. James Smith was an architect of some reputation. His Glasgow commissions were solid, his Edinburgh connections solid, his household managed by a wife who understood that the house itself was an argument, that the quality of the tablecloth and the comportment of the daughters were, in the Glasgow of the 1850s, a form of professional credential. They had 4 children. Madeline was the eldest daughter, and she had been educated at a school in London that her father's income could justify and her mother's ambitions required. What the school produced, or what it attempted to produce, was a young woman fitted for a particular kind of life. Watercolors, French conversation, the management of a household, the calibration of emotion to circumstance, which is to say, enough warmth to attract a husband of means, not so much as to alarm him. The curriculum was not written down anywhere. It did not need to be. Madeline returned to Glasgow in 1853 at 17. She was described by contemporaries as striking rather than beautiful. Dark-eyed, composed, with a steadiness in her manner that some found impressive, and others found unreadable. Her father's draftsman, a man named Robert Baird, would later say he had worked alongside her for 6 months, without ever being certain what she thought about anything. Whether that composure was temperamental or constructed is a question the record cannot answer. What the record can answer is when it cracked. Émile Langelier arrived in Glasgow in 1852, on a trajectory that was, by any measure, modest. He had been born in St. Helier, Jersey, in 1823, the son of a nurseryman, French-speaking Catholic European, in manner and a way that would have read as exotic in the drawing-rooms of Blitheswood Hill and disqualifying everywhere else. He was 31 when Madeline first saw him. He worked as a clerk for a merchant house on Bothwell Street. His salary was somewhere in the region of £50 a year. He was, by the social arithmetic of the Smith household, nothing. He was also, by every account that survives, acutely aware of this fact, and unwilling to accept it as permanent. His landlady, Mary Perry, described him as a man who dressed carefully on an income that could not afford careful dressing. She said he pressed his own trousers, that he owned 2 coats and rotated them so that neither showed excessive wear, that he kept a diary, though what it contained was never established, as it disappeared before the trial, a disappearance that was noted and then, somehow, not pursued. He had a habit of picking at the skin around his thumbnails. By the end of his life, both were scarred. They were introduced, or introduced themselves, depending on which account you credit, in the spring of 1855. The precise circumstances are contested. One version, given by a mutual acquaintance named Mary Jane Buchanan, holds that Langelier arranged to be introduced through her, that he had seen Madeline in the street, that he had inquired after her, that the introduction was engineered. Whether this is true or a later reconstruction to cast him as predatory cannot now be determined. What is established is that by the summer of 1855, they were exchanging letters through a covert system that Madeline had organized herself. Letters left with a servant, letters posted under false names, letters slipped through the garden door of the family's country house at Rowan. She was 19. He was 31. She had designed the system of concealment. That detail matters. The letters. There are, by the final count, entered into evidence, 87 letters, surviving from Madeline to Emile. None of his to her survive. She burned them, she said, or claimed to have. The imbalance is total. What we have is her voice, frozen in one direction, speaking to a silence. What she said in those letters stunned the courtroom in 1857. It stuns because of what it reveals about the distance between the performed life and the interior one, the distance that Glasgow in 1855 required young women of her class to maintain, and that Madeline, in ink, refused. She called him her husband. She called herself his wife. She wrote, and here the court record becomes circumspect in its transcription, using dashes where explicit content appeared, of physical intimacy in terms that left the advocate depute, the prosecutor, briefly without words. The Lord Justice Clerk was observed to remove his spectacles. The women in the gallery, of whom there were many, did not leave. To read the surviving letters, even now, even in the archive copies, is to encounter something that the Victorian framing cannot quite contain. They are not naive. They are not the letters of a girl who did not understand what she was writing. She understood precisely. "I did not know what love was till I met you," she wrote in one letter, and then, in the same paragraph, shifted to a description of what had passed between them at Rowan that made explicit she was not speaking of emotional recognition. She was speaking of the body. She signed many of them. "Your own Madeline, wife." The ink is still dark. Someone applied pressure to that page. For the first year of the correspondence, it seems to have been, if not equal, at least mutually chosen. Langelier wrote, his letters gone, but their content partially reconstructed through her replies. He appears to have been ardent. He appears to have matched her in register, though whether he initiated the explicit content or responded to it is impossible to determine from a one-sided archive. What can be traced through the chronology of her replies is a shift. Sometime in 1856, his letters began to carry another quality. She references, in her responses, his threats. She uses the word directly without euphemism, which is itself notable. She was a woman who could be indirect when she chose to be. "You say you will show my letters to Papa," she writes in a letter dated, by the court's reckoning, to early 1857. "I do not believe you would be so cruel." The letters themselves were, as she knew better than anyone, catastrophic. Not because they described a love affair. Affairs were not unknown in Glasgow, any more than they were unknown anywhere, but because of what they described specifically. The physical intimacy, the language. A daughter of James Smith of Blithswood Hill, writing that to a Jersey-born clerk on £50 a year. The letters did not merely prove she had loved him. They proved she had done so on her own terms, in her own words, without apology, for 2 years, while performing the model of Victorian daughterhood so completely that her father had noticed nothing. The distance between those two versions of Madeline Smith, the one at the dinner table, and the one at the writing desk at midnight, was not unusual for women of her era and class. What was unusual was that she had written it down. William Minnock appeared in the Smith household's social orbit in late 1855, and by 1856 it was clear to everyone with eyes, including apparently Madeline, where that orbit led. He was a merchant. He was solvent in a way that Langelier was not, and would never be. He was, by the account of those who knew him, a fundamentally decent man who had the specific misfortune of becoming entangled in a story about someone else. He courted Madeline in the approved fashion. He visited the house on Blitheswood Square. He took tea with her mother. He brought flowers of the correct variety in the correct quantity. He was, in the social grammar of mid-Victorian Glasgow, saying one sentence very clearly: "I am a man of appropriate standing who intends appropriate things." In January of 1857, Madeline accepted his proposal. What she did not do, what she appears to have believed she could manage without doing, was end the affair with Langelier before accepting it. There is no way to read that decision charitably. She was, in January of 1857, simultaneously engaged to William Minnock and corresponding with Émile Langelier. The letters to Langelier in this period shift register again. They become, depending on your interpretation, either genuinely conflicted or strategically warm, maintaining enough heat to keep him from acting while she worked out how to extricate herself. Which reading you prefer will determine everything else you think about her. What is established is that in late January of 1857, she wrote to Langelier asking to end the correspondence, that she requested the return of her letters, those 87 documents, each one a charge in waiting, and that Langelier refused. He refused, and he made clear why. The letter in which he makes his position explicit does not survive, but her response to it does. "I know what you mean," she wrote. "You will show them to Papa." Do it, then. Do it. I care not. She did care. Every subsequent action she took proves she cared. But she was also, and this is the Madeline Smith who is hardest to look away from, a woman who, even in extremis, could write a sentence designed to look like she didn't. Arsenic. The word sits differently in the 21st century than it sat in the 19th. We know it now as a toxin. Full stop. In 1857, it occupied a more complicated position. It was sold legally. It was used domestically, as a pesticide, as a dye, as a preservative. It appeared in wallpaper. It appeared in fabric. It appeared in the complexion preparations that Victorian women applied to their faces and necks in pursuit of the fashionable pallor that the era associated with refinement, the skin like something that had never been in the sun. The practice was real. Arsenic, taken in small quantities, was believed, genuinely believed, not merely claimed, to brighten the complexion and clear the skin. Women in rural Austria had been documented consuming arsenic doses that would have killed an unhabituated person. The practice was not secret. It was not even in 1857 particularly controversial. Madeline Smith purchased arsenic on 3 documented occasions. The first was in late January of 1857. The second was in February. The third was in March. She told the chemists she needed it for her complexion. She also told one of them, a druggist in Edinburgh visited during a family trip, that she required it for a garden preparation, to kill rats at the country house. She signed the poison register, as the law required, with her own name. She did not attempt to conceal the purchases from the record, which is either evidence of innocence or evidence of a composure so complete it had become indistinguishable from it. The arsenic she purchased was mixed with soot, as was legally required for retail sales, a measure intended to make it identifiable and render it, in theory, too visually obvious to be administered covertly in food or drink. Whether the soot made it to Émile Langelier's stomach along with the arsenic was something the toxicologist at the trial would attempt to determine, and failed to resolve to the jury's satisfaction. Langelier became ill for the first time in late January 1857. His symptoms: violent vomiting, abdominal cramping, a burning sensation in the throat, were consistent with arsenic poisoning. They were also consistent with a catalog of other conditions that would not have been unusual for a man of his health history. He had been treated for stomach complaints before. His physician, a Dr. Thompson, attended him and noted the severity, but did not suspect anything other than a gastrointestinal episode. He recovered. He became ill again in February. The same symptoms. Again he recovered, though more slowly. He told Mary Perry, his landlady, that he had been to see Miss Smith. He told her, and this is documented, Mary Perry gave evidence that he did not know what was wrong with him, but that the illness always followed a visit to Miss Smith, and that he had said as much to someone he trusted. He said this, and then, in the documentary record, nothing was done about it. He visited Madeline in late March of 1857. The exact date is uncertain. What is certain is that on the night of Saturday, the 21st of March, Émile Langelier returned from an outing whose destination was not established at trial, and arrived at his lodgings at Masson's Hotel in Franklin Place in extreme distress. He was vomiting. He was in severe pain. He collapsed in the hallway. Mary Perry and another lodger helped him to his room. His face, she said, was a color she did not have a word for, something between yellow and ash. He died at approximately 7 in the morning on Sunday, the 22nd of March, 1857. He was 34 years old. A post-mortem examination was conducted by Dr. Frederick Penny, professor of chemistry at Anderson's University. The science of toxicological examination in 1857 was not young. The Marsh test for arsenic had been in use since 1836, but it was still the subject of vigorous professional dispute, and the men who practiced it were aware that their testimony in court could be challenged by equally credentialed opponents. What Dr. Penny found in the body of Émile Langelier was 82 grains of arsenic. 82 grains. A fatal dose is generally considered to be between 2 and 3 grains. The quantity in Langelier's body was, by any clinical standard, massive. It was not the quantity of a man who had taken arsenic for his complexion. It was not the quantity that accumulated from Victorian wallpaper or impure drinking water. It was the quantity that arrives in food or drink deliberately, more than once. The letters were found among his effects, all 87 of them tied together, as if he had kept them organized. Madeline was arrested on the 31st of March, 9 days after Langelier's death. She had been, during those 9 days, at home in Blithswood Square. She had, her family would later say, appeared calm. She had eaten her meals. She had slept, or appeared to sleep. She had accepted the condolences of neighbors who knew only that a young man of her acquaintance had died unexpectedly. William Minnick had visited. What passed between them in those 9 days is not recorded. Their engagement was, without public statement, dissolved. He gave no evidence at the trial. He does not appear in the subsequent record of her life at all. She was taken to the sheriff's office and charged with murder. The Edinburgh Evening Courant had the story the same day. By the end of the week, every newspaper in Britain had it, and the particular quality of the coverage. The letters, the arsenic, the composed young woman, the dead Frenchman, had already established the shape the story would take in the public imagination. It would take that shape for 160 years. The trial opened at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh on the 30th of June, 1857. It lasted 9 days. The public galleries were full from the first morning. The queue to enter had begun before dawn. Among those who attended were women of social standing, not the women one might expect at a sensational murder trial, but the women of Edinburgh's professional and merchant classes, who came in their day dresses and sat in the gallery and listened to the letters read aloud with an attention that the newspapers described, with transparent discomfort, as avide. The charges were 3. The murder of Émile Langelier by arsenic poisoning on or about the 19th of February, the murder by arsenic poisoning on or about the 22nd of February, and the murder by arsenic poisoning on or about the 23rd of March. She pleaded not guilty to all 3. She sat in the dock in a dress described by the press as brown silk, with a white collar. Several reporters noted her composure. One noted her hands, gloved, folded, still. She looked at no one in particular. She looked at the letters when they were produced as evidence. What her expression was then, the reports do not agree on. Some say she dropped her gaze. One report, a single correspondent for the Glasgow Herald, says she did not. The prosecution was led by the Lord Advocate, James Moncrieff. His case was, in its architecture, straightforward. Langelier had died of massive arsenic poisoning. Madeleine had purchased arsenic on 3 occasions. The letters established both motive, Langelier's threat to expose them, and opportunity, through their documented meetings. The sequence was damning. It was exactly the kind of evidence chain that prosecutors dream of. Purchase, meeting, illness, purchase, meeting, illness, purchase, meeting, death. The advocate depute, Donald Mackenzie, read the letters. He read them, beginning to end, in the correct chronological order, in a voice that the Caledonian Mercury described as flat and deliberate, which is the voice you would use if you were trying to prevent the content from becoming theatrical, and which had the paradoxical effect of making it more so. The letters landed in the courtroom as documents, as things that existed, as objects with weight. The language in those letters, the declarations of love, the physical descriptions, the word husband used over and over, the word wife, fell into a room full of Victorian Edinburgh that had no ready place to put them. The Lord Justice Clerk, Lord Hope, made notes. The jury of 15 men, Edinburgh common sense in its hats and its side whiskers, sat and listened, and to all outward appearance felt something that their faces were trained not to show. Madeleine Smith sat and listened to her own voice, read back to her. The question is always whether she had any idea, in 1855 and 1856, that this was where the letters would end up. Whether any part of her, writing at midnight in the country house at Rowan, heard the future of the words she was making. What is recorded is that she wrote them anyway. John Inglis, Dean of Faculty, was the best defense advocate in Scotland. This was not a contemporary judgment or a retrospective one. It was simply understood, in the Edinburgh of 1857, as a fact of the legal landscape, the way you might understand the height of a particular building or the depth of a particular lock. He was 41. He had large hands and a voice that his opponents described as simultaneously conversational and inescapable, a voice that seemed to be speaking only to you and could be heard clearly at the back of the room. He would later become Lord Justice General, the highest judicial office in Scotland. That is the trajectory against which his defense of Madeleine Smith was delivered. His opening address lasted 4 hours. What he did in those 4 hours was not what you might expect from a Victorian advocate defending a young woman against a murder charge in a climate of outraged public morality. He did not deny the letters. He did not minimize them. He did not ask the jury to discount or overlook them. He picked them up. "My lords and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "you have heard these letters. You will have formed from them some impression of the woman who wrote them. I ask you to examine that impression with care, because the question before you is not whether Madeleine Smith is a woman of proper feeling. The question before you is whether she is a murderess, and these are not the same question." It was an argument that required the jury to separate two things that the entire structure of the prosecution, and indeed the entire structure of Victorian morality, had worked to fuse. The letters were the motive, yes, but they were also, he argued, evidence of something else, a passion, genuine enough that she would have had no need to kill him, because a woman who felt as she described was not yet, in early 1857, ready to let go. He paused on the arsenic purchases. He acknowledged them directly. He argued that the evidence of a legitimate practice, the cosmetic use of arsenic, was sufficient in the absence of proof that the arsenic she purchased had entered Langelier's body, to create reasonable doubt. The soot mixed into the purchased arsenic had not been identified in the post-mortem analysis. Dr. Penny acknowledged this on cross-examination with a directness that was, in the context of the trial, useful to the defense. He could say arsenic was present. He could not say it was the arsenic she bought. "You cannot convict a woman of murder," Inglis told the jury, "on the grounds that arsenic was found, that she purchased arsenic, and that the arsenic found was of a kind she might have purchased. The whole edifice of the prosecution rests on a coincidence, and coincidence is not proof." It lasted 4 hours. The courtroom did not empty. The Crown's response to the arsenic identification problem was to lean harder on motive and circumstance, which is to say, on the letters. The more the letters were discussed, the more the trial became, at its core, a trial not of a poisoner, but of a particular kind of woman. A woman who had written those things, a woman who had, without male permission, conducted a 2-year love affair with a man her father would not receive, on terms she had largely set, in language that made it clear she had been neither passive nor ignorant. Several witnesses for the prosecution, in the details of their testimony that went slightly beyond what the questions required, managed to convey the impression that Madeline Smith was not a woman to be trusted, not because of the arsenic, because of the letters. Her own character witnesses, women from her social circle, her drawing teacher, a family friend, described her as steady, kind, attentive to her duties. These words, in the context of the trial, read as a translation of what they were not permitted to say directly, which was, "She is not the woman the letters make her appear." Whether they believed this is unknowable. Whether they were telling the truth as they understood it is equally unknowable. What they were doing, plainly, was trying to save her with the only tool available, the restoration of a reputation that the letters had made into a public document. Inglis did not use them much. He understood something the Crown may not have fully grasped. The character witnesses were fighting the wrong war. The jury did not need to be convinced Madeline was a good woman. They needed to be convinced the evidence did not prove she was a murderer. Those were different arguments, and only one of them could win. The medical evidence occupied 3 days. Dr. Penny held his position under cross-examination with some tenacity, which Inglis acknowledged before systematically undermining the implications. Yes, arsenic was present. Yes, the quantity was large. Yes, death was consistent with arsenic poisoning. But could Dr. Penny say, could any medical man say, that the arsenic had been administered by another person rather than ingested voluntarily? Could he say when it had been administered? Could he rule out self-medication with arsenic, a practice documented in the period? He could not. This is the point at which the trial's outcome became possible, if not yet certain. Not because the evidence was weak. 82 grains is not an ambiguous finding, but because the chain of proof had a gap in it, and gaps in a murder trial are where juries live. They are the rooms where doubt takes up residence. The defense also called attention to Langelier's diary, the missing diary, the diary that Mary Perry had mentioned that Langelier had apparently kept and that had not been found among his effects. The Crown had no explanation for its absence that satisfied. Inglis did not press the point hard. He did not need to. He simply noted, for the jury, that a diary, which might have contained evidence of Langelier's own practices, his own health, his own habits, was not available. He said it once. He moved on. He understood the weight of once. The jury deliberated for 25 minutes. 25 minutes. For a 9-day trial, for a case that had occupied the newspaper columns of Scotland for 3 months, that had been discussed in London drawing rooms and New York parlors, that had produced the most explicit letters read aloud in a British court in the 19th century. 25 minutes. What happened in that room is not recorded. No juryman wrote a memoir of the deliberation. No account was given to the press. The door closed. 25 minutes passed. The door opened. Not proven. On all 3 charges. Not proven. The verdict was announced into a courtroom that, the reports agree on this, went briefly and completely silent before it did not. There was sound. It took different forms in different parts of the room. In the gallery, where the Edinburgh women had sat for 9 days, there was what the Scotsman described as a collective exhalation. In the press bench, pencils moved. In the dock, Madeline Smith's face did what it had done for 9 days. Very little. What the Lord Justice Clerk said in response to the verdict is not recorded in the transcripts I have found. What is recorded is that she was discharged, that she stood, that she walked out of that courtroom and into the rest of her life. The public reaction was neither surprise nor satisfaction. It was something more like agitation, the condition of a crowd that has witnessed something it does not know how to classify. Not proven was not acquittal. It was, as many commentators noted immediately, a verdict that said, "We have failed to prove it," which is not the same as saying it did not happen. The Scotsman expressed reservations about the verdict's implications. The Glasgow Herald noted that the majority of the medical evidence had not been controverted on its central finding. Several English newspapers, working from a legal tradition that did not include "not proven," attempted to explain it to their readers and found that the explanation, the more it was elaborated, became more troubling rather than less. In Edinburgh, a crowd had gathered outside the court. When Madeline emerged, in that brown silk dress, with her gloved hands and her stillness, there was something that several witnesses described, in their diaries and letters, with a discomfort they did not entirely articulate. It was not celebration, it was not condemnation, it was the noise of people looking at a woman they could not categorize and finding the experience unsettling. She did not speak to any of them. She had not spoken publicly at any point in the trial. In Scottish procedure of the period, the accused did not give evidence. She had sat in the dock for 9 days and heard everything said about her, the letters, the arsenic, the dead man's symptoms, her own midnight words read in a flat voice to a crowded room. And she had not been required to respond to any of it. She hadn't. Her composure was therefore either the serenity of the innocent or the discipline of the very guilty, and the jury had found it impossible to say which. That impossibility is the verdict. It lives in "not proven," like an answer that knows it is not an answer. She was back in Glasgow within days. The Smith household on Blithswood Square was, for some time, difficult to occupy. The social world that had structured her life, the dinner tables, the drawing-room visits, the measured progression toward a respectable marriage, was no longer straightforwardly available to her. William Minnick was gone. Her father, James Smith, the architect, the man whose professional credentials had been maintained in part by the comportment of his daughters. He did not, as far as the record shows, discuss the trial with her in any conversation that was preserved. What he did was clear the house. By 1858, the Smith family had left Glasgow. James Smith relocated his practice. The house on Blithswood Square was let to another family, and then another, and eventually its connection to the trial faded to the kind of local knowledge that gets passed between neighbors and then stops. Madeline married in 1861. The man was George Wardle, an artist and later a manager at William Morris's firm, the firm that made, among other things, the Morris wallpaper that decorated the walls of fashionable Victorian houses. The wallpaper that contained, in some of its dyes, arsenic. Whether anyone ever mentioned this to her is not recorded. She moved in circles that would not, in later decades, have seemed to belong to the same life as the Glasgow of 1857. The William Morris connection placed her in the company of the arts and crafts movement, designers, reformers, socialists of the aesthetic variety who cared about beauty as a political project. She had children. She managed a household. She appears to have been, in the testimony of those who knew her during these years, and who wrote about it much later, a woman of considerable practical competence and social ease. Whether she was liked or merely handled is something the record does not settle. She was a woman whose past was not entirely private knowledge. The trial had been too public for that, but the arts and crafts world of the 1870s and 1880s had a sufficiently different cultural grammar from the Glasgow merchant class of the 1850s that the past could be, if not erased, then at least placed at a distance where it did not interfere with daily commerce. George Wardle died in 1889. She was 53. She did not remain a widow long. In 1893, at 57, she married again. The second husband was a man named William A. Sheehy, an American. She moved to New York, then eventually to the American South. She became, in the final decades of her life, not Madeline Smith of Glasgow, but Lena Wardle Sheehy, of wherever she had settled most recently. She outlived Sheehy as well. She was living in London when she died, in April of 1928. She was 93 years old. The death certificate gives her name as Lena Wardle Sheehy. The cause of death is listed as pneumonia. She died in lodgings in Tooting, which is not a part of London that appears in the histories of the Victorian upper middle class, and which may have been chosen for precisely that reason. The newspapers, when they reported her death, used both names. Madeline Smith, several of them headed the notice, and then below that, in smaller type, née Smith, known in later life as Lena Wardle Sheehy. The trial was summarized. The letters were mentioned. The not-proven verdict was explained to readers who were young enough that 1857 was, to them, a different century. Which it was, exactly. No one reported any last words. No memoir existed. No letter addressed to posterity had been found among her effects, or if it had, it did not enter the public record. She had spent 71 years, almost the length of one full human life, not speaking about the trial, not speaking about Langelier, not speaking about the letters, the arsenic, the 9 days in Edinburgh, the 25 minutes of deliberation, the 2 words that had sent her into the morning. Whether the silence was guilt or grief or simply self-preservation deployed over a long enough period that it became indistinguishable from character, that question is one the record refuses to answer. The question the record does answer, the one the trial was supposed to answer and did not, is not whether she did it. That question is, at 167 years' distance, unanswerable in any form that satisfies. The prosecution's case was strong in circumstance and weak in direct proof. The defense's case was strong in procedure and weak in alternative explanation. What did she do with the arsenic she purchased if not administer it to him? No answer was ever offered. No answer exists in any document I have found. 82 grains. That number does not go away. You can argue about the soot, about the timing, about the cosmetic use of arsenic, about Langelier's own habits and his missing diary, and his history of stomach complaints. You can make every argument that John Inglis made, and some of them are genuinely good arguments. And you are left, still, with 82 grains of arsenic in the body of a man who died in the early morning of a Sunday in March, after telling his landlady that his illnesses always followed visits to Madeline Smith. Not proven is not the same as not guilty. It never was. It is a verdict that means the law will not punish you. It is not a verdict that means the thing did not happen. The trial asked whether she was a poisoner. The public asked whether she was a proper woman. Neither question got an answer that the questioners found satisfying, and this is perhaps what makes the case resistant to the passage of time. Not the arsenic, not the letters, but the gap between what was asked and what was answered. A gap that has the shape of a person who spent 71 years declining to close it. John Inglis's defense speech is studied in Scottish legal education still. It is treated as a model of advocacy, of how to reframe the question before the jury so that the question it answers becomes a different question than the one the Crown posed. It is brilliant. It is, if you accept the most likely account of what happened, brilliant in the service of acquitting a murderer. That is what advocacy sometimes is. The law does not promise otherwise. The not proven verdict is still available in Scottish law. It is used dozens of times a year in cases involving insufficient evidence, in cases where the jury cannot reach the standard required for conviction. It is not controversial in most of those cases. It is a legal instrument, nothing more, but it carries still the particular weight of having been used in June of 1857 in Edinburgh for a woman in a brown silk dress who sat for 9 days, and then stood, and then walked. In Scotland, when the not-proven verdict is discussed, it is sometimes called the bastard verdict, a term that has been in use since at least the 18th century, and that captures something the legal system itself has never resolved, which is whether a verdict that means probably but not beyond doubt is a form of justice or a form of evasion. The debate continues. Reforms have been proposed. The verdict persists. The letters are held at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. They are catalogued. They are accessible under the usual archival conditions to researchers. The paper has not significantly deteriorated. The ink is dark in places, faded in others, corresponding to how much pressure was applied to the nib. There are 87 of them. She wrote the first when she was 19. She wrote the last one that survives, in early 1857, 6 weeks before Langelier died. In that last letter, she is asking him to return the previous letters. She is using the word please. She is, for the first and only time in the surviving correspondence, asking him for something rather than telling him. The change in register is audible even on the page, even now, even at this distance. He did not return them. He kept them organized, tied together, where they would be found. The question of whether that was the act of a man preserving something precious or a man maintaining a weapon is the kind of question that cannot be answered about the dead. Langelier left no memoir. His diary is gone. What he felt, whether he loved her and was frightened of losing her, or whether he understood the letters as leverage from the beginning, or whether, as is most likely, he felt both things at once and could not separate them, is not in any document I have encountered. He died at 34 in a boarding house in Glasgow on a Sunday morning in March, in a color his landlady could not name. He had pressed his own coats for economy. He had been, by all accounts, charming in company. He had written her letters she burned. He is buried in Ramshorn Kirkyard. The grave marker is modest. It gives his name, his age, his dates. It does not give a cause of death. She was 93 when she died in London in April of 1928. The century she had lived across, Victoria, Edward, the war, everything that remade the world between 1857 and 1928, had not required her to speak. She had moved through it. She had married twice, outlived both husbands, born children, changed names, changed cities, changed countries. She had never spoken of it. What she took with her, whether it was guilt or grief or something that had become, over 71 years, simply weather, is not knowable. It is not in the archive. The archive stops in 1857, with the last letter, with the plea for the letters back, with the handwriting that presses hard in some places and barely makes a mark in others. She was 21 when she wrote those letters. She was 21 when they were read aloud. She was 21 for the rest of her life, in the only place where the record holds her still. The letters are in Glasgow. Her handwriting is in Glasgow. The girl who wrote them, the girl who pressed hard into the paper at midnight in the country house, who signed herself your own Madeline, wife, who built a system of concealment and ran it for 2 years, and did not think, when she wrote the words down, about where words go when you let them leave your hand. That girl is in Glasgow. She walked out. She lived 71 years. She never came back. The letters waited.